Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocko Selberg, and somewhere out there pondering her agility is the always liminal Barbara Frontera, and together we co-host the lounge. Our third esteemed co-organizer, Tiani Jones, will be facilitating the Q&A today. But before we kick it off, just a few ground rules. We will be recording today's session, so if you do not wish to be recorded, please make sure your camera and microphone are turned off. And after Karl's talk, we'll have a question and answer period and hopefully a nice conversation with all of you. Should you have a question or comment, you can either raise your Zoom hand or just send your question directly to Tiani via the chat with a big Q in front, and she'll probably just ask you to read it out for yourself. And just a reminder that the recordings will be posted to Vimeo on our Complexity Lounge page in the next few days, and that is where you'll find all of our other past videos from the lounge. Today, we welcome Karl Scotland to the Complexity Lounge. Karl has long advocated for lean and agile approaches to addressing complex business challenges, working with companies such as the BBC, Yahoo, Rally, Cisco, HSBC, Sky, and other, and is a regular conference speaker with a long-standing interest in complex systems. In today's talk, Karl will give his thoughts on how tools and frameworks such as Agile operate in complex environments. Then we'll open the floor for discussion. So Karl Scotland, welcome to the lounge.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. So I'll kick off before I share my slides. I'll maybe just explain why this talk is this. I'm going to share some slides, do a talk, but before I get into this, why did I call this "That's Not My Agile"? So I don't know whether this is just a kind of UK children's book. If people are familiar with this, so this is a book called "That's Not My Train." And just down the bottom, it says its wheels are too squishy. And if I poke there, it has indeed got squishy wheels. So I'm a Lean and Agile consultant. Spend a lot of time in the Lean and Agile space, working with organizations. And my LinkedIn feed is basically filled with people arguing about Agile. And whenever I see these posts, I always kind of think about this book or this kind of series of books and kind of why don't we just write one called That's Not My Agile? And then we can do that. So I kind of did that. I didn't publish the whole book, but let me share my slides. Hopefully that comes through. I did do a little bit of artwork and kind of create based on this one. That's Not My Agile. Its batch size is too large. And then I did put together a whole load of things like what would be in this book if we did actually make it. So That's Not My Agile. Its time box is too long. That's Not My Agile. Its customer is not on site. That's Not My Agile. Its tests are too slow. That's Not My Agile. Its backlog is too long, etc. I've got a good 2 or 3 post-it notes full of those, but I won't bore you with them. So this isn't really a kind of a talk about Agile itself. It's a talk about my experience with Agile, but I guess more pertinent for this group is how do you bring a complexity-informed kind of view to an Agile transformation and get away with all these arguments about Agile. And even that isn't a new idea. So I found this kind of tweet came up a few weeks ago from 2009. So this was at the very first Lean and Kanban conference in Miami that I was at. And Gene Baker said we should focus on organizational change, not lean or agile. And this is, say, 2009, 15 years ago. Gene back then was kind of saying it's not about lean or agile. 15 years later, my LinkedIn feed is still filled with people arguing about lean or agile. And I kind of think we're missing the point. So this is what this talk is really about. This is the way I think about Agile transformations, organizations in general, really. So as I say, it's not really about Agile. I guess there's some Agile references in there because I kind of put this together mostly for an Agile audience. But really, the way I think about transformations is outcome-oriented, continuous transformation, engaging everyone, everywhere. So I'm going to spend this talk kind of digs into these 3 ideas: being outcome-oriented, transformation being continuous, and engaging everyone everywhere. And actually think about Agile in those terms as there isn't a single Agile. So another quote I use, I talk about doing agile is a tactic. So we have to do agile. We have to have agile processes and practices that we need to do. Otherwise, we don't be agile. So being agile is evidential. You need to do agile to be agile. And again, lots of arguments around, should you be doing agile? Should you be focusing on being agile? Or should you even focus on having agility? So I describe having agility as being strategic. And you need all of those three things. But even then, actually, it's all to help our organizations meet their aspirational goals, meet their aspirations. And all of that is guided by a true north. So I kind of break it out and I have this model. And again, I'll dig into this model in a little bit more detail. But if you work this back, you start with a true north, understand what your aspirations are in the transformation, have a strategy. So what's your strategy for the transformation? What evidence are you going to look for that the transformation is having the effect you want? And then what are you actually going to do? What tactics are you going to employ? So I call that my taste model. And you need to have all of those things. And I think one of the challenges I see in organizations is that people focus on one or two of those things at best, and the other things are missing. So actually, we want transformations to be wholehearted. So Mike Burrows coined this phrase of the wholehearted organization, and he picked up the phrase from Christopher Alexander in The Timeless Way of Building. He said, a thing is whole according to how free it is of inner contradictions. When it is at war with itself and gives rise to forces which act to tear it down, it is unwhole. The more free it is of its own inner contradictions, the more whole and healthy and wholehearted it becomes. So I think of a transformation as we're trying to help organizations be wholehearted. And actually, if I apply this to Agile specifically, actually, I want Agile to be wholehearted. I want to be getting rid of all those inner contradictions where people are fighting and arguing. And if we just want to get all of that coherent with each other. So, as I said, I'll kind of go through those three areas, and we'll start with outcome oriented. So what I mean by outcome oriented is moving from thinking about implementation to thinking about impact. A lot of time people kind of say, oh yeah, we're outcome oriented. And well, actually a lot of people kind of talk about being outcome driven. And when they say they're being outcome driven, what they're really talking about is having a solution in mind, and what their outcome is to implement the solution. By outcome oriented, I mean more about thinking about the impact, and are we moving towards having an impact? So we're moving in the right direction. I try to draw on the model from Stephen Bungay in The Art of Action to kind of help describe why we need to do this. It's because we don't know what the right solution and what the right implementation is going to be. So Bungay talks about you want to achieve outcomes. To achieve those outcomes, you put plans in place. You take those plans, put them into action. Then when you take action, you hopefully will achieve outcomes. But actually, Bungay describes these three gaps: the knowledge gap, the alignment gap, and the effects gap. And it's the knowledge gap that I think is more interesting here, really. The difference between what we would like to know and what we actually know. So we don't actually know what solution we need to have because we're dealing with complex problems. So there's this gap between what we know, what we like to know, what we need to know, and therefore we can't actually create plans. And then there's the alignment gap. So difference between what we want people to do and what they actually do. And then the effects gap, difference between what we expect our actions to achieve and what they actually achieve. So we don't even put good plans to place, but even if we had the right plans, people probably won't follow them. And even if people did follow them, they're probably not going to give us the results we want. So Bungay talks about closing those gaps, and actually what you need to do start with intent. So you close the gap between outcomes and plans, not by telling people what to do, but by giving people intent and then allowing people to come up with their own plans. So that idea of starting with intent for me is kind of the root of being outcome oriented. It helps people understand what you'd like them to achieve, and then they can come up with these things themselves. So Dave Snowden calls this a vective theory of change. And I can imagine most people on this are fairly familiar with this idea, but rather than setting explicit goals and using those goals as our measure of success, but it's identifying a direction we want to move in, and then deciding whether, what's our dispositional landscape, what things do we do to move in the right direction, or what things do we need to dampen to stop us moving in the wrong direction. So this idea of a vector-based target is really what I mean by outcome-oriented. So then, kind of a lot of this is me kind of pulling on different models. I like the idea of this ideal present canvas as a way of starting to think about how do we be outcome oriented. So this is from Jay Bloom and Ben Moser. Starting with your present mess, and defining mess, or using Ackoff's definition of mess as a system of problems. So there's no single thing we can address, but we've got this system of problems. What's good at the moment, what's bad at the moment, thinking forward to the future mess. So if we don't do anything, what mess are we going to end up with? That's our future mess. Let's talk about that. Then what would we want the ideal future be? I think Acker talks more about idealized than ideal, but what will be different in the future? What would we like to be different in the future compared to the present mess and the potential future mess? And then we can talk about the ideal present. So what do we need to do today to deal with the present mess, avoid the future mess, and make the ideal future more possible? So help us move towards that ideal future. The idea of acting in the present, then, again, is that other key part of being outcome oriented. So we know what direction we want to move in, and then what can we do today to make today better? So I find that ideal, this canvas, and start to think about, the present mess, the future mess, the ideal future, and then the ideal present, gets people in that mind to think about being outcome oriented and transformation as a sense of direction. And then we can start articulating things like the true north. So the true north, I define the true north, the orientation that informs what we do. So the true north as the metaphor is not the destination. When we're kind of orienteering, or we're kind of out in the wild and we're trying to figure out which direction we go in, we're not literally trying to get to the North Pole. The true north is just the direction, is just what we use to set our direction. Similarly, the other variation is the North Star. When you're navigating by the North Star, you're not actually trying to get to the North Star. So that true north is all about orientation. And again, I see people talking about true north again in terms of solutions or implementation. So these 3 C's here are the ways I ask people to think about what their true north is. I want it to be concrete, because I want it to be something that people can imagine. The true north isn't just, being the best in our industry, being the number one. That's not concrete. Concrete is something that we can imagine, but it's challenging. So it's probably not something that we're going to be able to achieve. It's going to be out of reach. It's just over the horizon, but it's compelling enough that's going to make us want to get there. So team I was working with a year or so ago, their true north was something around the lines of near instantaneous deployment and delivery. So they had this idea of their true north. They wanted to be able to write some code, commit that code, and that code would go through the deployment pipeline and be live. So the customer could literally come, ask them for a feature, small feature, they could write it, they could deliver that feature, near instantaneously. It's concrete because they could imagine what that deployment pipeline might be like. It's compelling. It's something they definitely wanted to do, but it's challenging because they knew there was a lot of work in it, and probably being that near instantaneous wasn't realistic. Or certainly, not economically realistic. But those 3 C's kind of gives us a way of thinking around defining direction, really. What is it we're trying to achieve? What direction do we want to be heading in? And then the phrase at the bottom, I think I picked up from kind of personal development world, be who you want to be, not what you want to do. So again, it's just the idea of the true north is not defining a solution, but it's kind of describe what we want to be in the future. So that's true north. And then the other side of it, then the next bit down is aspirations. So we want organizations to meet their aspirations. So they're the results they hope to achieve, the business results. So I kind of tie this back to Don Reinertsen, his principles of product development flow. The very first of his 170 odd principles is the principle of quantified overall economics, where he says select actions based on a quantified overall economic impact. So basically what he's talking about is having an economic framework that we can use that helps us decide what we're going to do and helps us make decisions. So when I think of aspirations, I'm thinking in terms of what is your business's economic framework, and how might you use that framework to help you define success? So in 12 months' time or so, when we look back and we say, yeah, that was a good year, our transformation was successful, what sort of things are we going to look for? So I like the Joshua Arnold's model of value as a way of thinking about economic impact. So I'll put the URL. But he talks about these four buckets: increasing revenue, maintaining revenue, decreasing cost, avoiding cost. I generally don't like putting actual, monetary revenue and cost figures in there, but what's the model behind that? What's your economic model? So what is it? What things do you do which will increase revenue? Is it, typically in a product world, it's, number of sales, number of transactions, number of customers, number of page views, those sorts of things. Increasing revenue is new revenue. Maintaining revenue, how do we make sure we're keeping the revenue that we've already got? That might be customer churn. Decreasing cost, so that's decreasing existing costs. So that's where we might be talking about cost savings and process efficiencies. Avoiding cost is avoiding a new cost that have not already occurred, and that might be, avoiding a regulatory fine or something like that. So that's kind of sort of level I think when I talk about organisations meeting their aspirations, that it's a really trailing metric. So aspirations to me are a trailing measure that help us define and describe what does success look like for organizations. So between a true north and your aspirations, I think you have a good sense, a good way of defining direction and being outcome oriented. So that leads us to continuous transformation. So this is shifting from transformation as a one-off project into just being an ongoing way of life, an ongoing operating model. So I'm okay with the idea of transformation. I don't have a problem with that word, but I usually qualify it with transformation is continuous. You don't transformation, in the agile world, we don't kind of go, oh, we've done our agile transformation, we're now agile, we're done. Transformation is constantly changing. So I tie this into strategy and specifically emergent strategy. So when we're transforming, a transformation is generally the implementation of the strategy. Mintzberg has this model in Strategy Safari where he talks about one way of doing a strategy is you have an intended strategy. You deliberately implement that strategy, and then that strategy becomes realized. So in nice, simple cases, that works. In more complex cases, and I'd argue in just in most cases in general, that doesn't work. The deliberate strategy actually, going back to Bungay, we don't have all the information, so it doesn't work as we expect it to, and it just becomes unrealized. The alternative is the idea of emergent strategy, where we just look at the patterns and the repeated things that are happening over time, what's working, what's not working, from those observations, either looking at what's happening inside the organization or outside the organization, that strategy emerges, and therefore we get a realized strategy from the emergence of all the different things. So for me, it's in a complex world, it's more about emergent strategy than it is about intended strategy. And therefore that, intended strategy is really that strategy as a plan. We do the strategy deliberately and it's realized. Emergent strategy, new things are always emerging. The patterns and the context is always shifting. So if we're talking about strategy, then we can look at Rummel's definition of strategy and good strategy, bad strategy. Strategy as guiding policies. That's kind of the core of it, I think. What's the approach to addressing the challenge of an opportunity? Before that, you need your diagnosis. So what is the challenge or opportunity that we're facing? What problem do we need to solve? We put our guiding policies in place, and then we have coherent action. The emergent strategy is, so much like continuous diagnosis as it is continuous transformation. We're constantly looking at what problem we're trying to solve. Have we solved it? Has the problem shifted? Has the problem changed? And therefore we update our guiding policies. So to bring this back to Agile briefly, I look at the manifesto Agile Manifesto really is as a strategy statement. So the typical the four in the middle are typically called the values of the manifesto: individuals and interactions over processes and tools. To me, if we go back to the Rumont model and with guiding policies, these were four guiding policies to enable choice. What kind of potentially got lost is the diagnosis. So what brought the manifesto signatories together was a diagnosis of a problem in the industry at a time. They came up with a manifesto as a set of guiding policies, and then what they were all kind of implicitly doing with the different methods of XP, Scrum, DSDM, all that, those were just the different coherent actions that they were taking. So we still, I find it a useful exercise to with actual transformations, to look at the manifesto and say, well, what have we learned over the last 20 years? So the first line is we're uncovering better ways of developing software. What have we uncovered over the last 20 years? What's the diagnosis of the thing we're trying to solve in our organization today? And therefore, what would our manifesto be? So what are our guiding policies that are going to help us take action, coherent action within a transformation? What happens a lot of time is just people dive straight into the tactics. They start taking action in the transformation. It's not coherent. There's no strategy. They've not really thought about what problem they're trying to solve. So that's why I bring strategy into this idea of transformation and continuous transformation. That leads us into, well, actually, what do we do? I'm guessing probably most people on this call know where this quote is from. I'm pretty sure Dave Snowden will have talked about it before, and this is one I got from him: the frozen tier strategy. That idea of we're just going to do the next right thing. So part of continuous transformation is just continuously taking small steps. What's the next step that we can do? What's the next thing we can try that is coherent action in line with our guiding policies, that addresses the result of our diagnosis. Another way of looking at that is what Jay Bloom calls gap thinking versus present thinking. So the gap thinking is looking for your ideal future state. What's your solution that you want to implement? And just trying to close the gap, making a huge step towards that ideal future state. Present thinking, this is similar to the canvas that Jabe has. What's our ideal current state? Rather than trying to predict and plan towards an ideal future state, how can we make today better? And that ideal current state moves us a step towards our intent. That ideal current state becomes a new current state, and then next step towards our new ideal current state, and so on. So continuous transformation is this idea of constantly making the current state into an ideal current state, and then making that new current state into the next ideal current state, and so on. And if you're just moving in a direction outcome oriented towards your intent, you can just carry on doing that forever. And probably at some point, you're going to want to change direction. So that brings us back to my kind of taste model and evidence. So agility and being agile as being evidential. What outcomes can we look for that are going to indicate that we're making progress? So this is more leading metrics. So if our aspirations are lagging metrics, this evidence is leading metrics that we can look at to kind of go, are we meeting our intent? Are we kind of meeting our strategy? I like this model here that I kind of adapted for Troy McGinnis. It's his 6 dimensions of performance. Again, they're still outcomes, but they're more nearer term outcomes. But are we delivering more value? Are we being more productive as an organization? Are we being more predictable organization, more responsive? Is quality getting better? Are we being more sustainable? And there's lots of different measures you could put in place there. And I kind of like to think you need a balance of all 6 probably, so you don't go in too hard on any one of them. So obviously we're trying to avoid good hearts lowering, where these measures become targets and therefore start driving bad behavior. So if we want our organization to be more productive, and maybe we're going to measure throughput as a measure of productivity, we want to make sure that we're not focusing so hard on productivity that we're reducing quality, because by cutting corners. So having a kind of balanced set of 6 measures that we can put in place for the transformation that are going to provide evidence that our strategies are working. And then you get into the tactics. So what are we actually going to do? What coherent action will we take? And this is where there's no right or wrong answers. And this is where there's a lot of the arguments on LinkedIn, on social media about Agile are kind of become a bit of a waste of time. So this is a little model. And I kind of think the model itself is not that important, but the idea that there are many practices out there that we could use, and how can we help people be more exploratory and more creative in coming up with practices. So this kind of came out of listening to Dave Snowden talk about his estuarine mapping, and he has triads around constraints. I kind of thought, well, there's so many practices out there. How might you create a couple of typologies around practices which are going to help people think through them? So you've got socio-technical across the top. On the social side, processes. So what are the different processes people might use? What things might you do to help grow or develop people themselves? Plexus, I'm a bit of a fan of kind of using words that all start with the same letter. So plexus is kind of a posh word for networks. How do people interact with each other and their processes and those people? So that's kind of the social side of it. On the technical side, you've got the technical practices that teams and people might use. You've got the products that people are building themselves, and what practices that are product focused, and then maybe there's some platform focused, either platforms that you're building or platforms that you're using. So I just put that together. I don't think the model is that important. I think what's more interesting is thinking of tactics in terms of typology and saying there's no right or wrong. But what things might we try to help us with our transformation? So really that's getting into the idea of tactics as experiments. So what small safe-to-fail tests can we run, which are going to help us understand what's going to work and what's not going to work within our transformation, where we've got the evidence to kind of show whether our hypotheses are right or wrong. The other thing I have in this definition of experiment is which improvements are technologically and operationally feasible. I find a lot of organizations just want to make too big a step. So what can we do today? That's like what's technologically possible, or what's even operationally feasible. Again, I kind of picked up that language and that idea from Ackoff as well in idealized design. So what could we do today? Again, many adjacent possibilities, lots of things we can do. So this is the first of a number of A3s that I'll show, but introducing the idea of running experiments to organizations, giving them an A3 as a template to start thinking through what is our hypothesis, what problem we're trying to solve, why do we think this hypothesis is rational and coherent, what are we going to do, etc. So the last bit then, engaging everyone anywhere. So this is thinking around transformation in terms of something that's not just defined by a central group, a leadership function, or a center of excellence, or an outside consultancy that comes in and gives you a blueprint. We want everybody, as many people in the organization contributing to our strategy as we can. So everybody's involved. So this is where I kind of talk about strategy deployment. And this is really how I think about all transformations, and specifically agile transformations. And one of the things I've been working on is how do you bring the ideas behind strategy deployment into agile transformations? So the way I've been defining it and describing it is strategy deployment is any transformational approach where solutions emerge from the people closest to the problem. So rather than just a central group, not just kind of going, right, here's the problem we have and here's the solution, we go out to the organizations, the people that are really doing the work. Let's find out what their experiences are, what their stories are, what ideas they have for change, and then let's try using those solutions rather than just doing it centrally. I was listening to a podcast with Jay Bloom over the weekend, and he kind of got me thinking about this definition. And one of the things he was talking about, that in the complex space, there isn't any one solution. Sorry, there isn't any one problem, and there isn't really any one solution. So going back to the idea of Ackoff and a mess being a system of problems, actually that's what we're dealing with. So I'm kind of playing around with an update to my definition of strategy deployment. Jabe talked about, instead of solutions, instead of problems, he talked about context. There's just context. And then if solutions, you have propositions. So I played around with those ideas, and I'm just kind of now thinking strategy deployment is transformation approach where the hypotheses for solutions emerge for people from the people closest to the mess, where it's the mess of problems. But I think that the idea is the same. I like that idea that trying to get away from problem and solution as these static things, which kind of go back to that idea of a transformation as being a project. If transformation is continuous transformation, then we're dealing with an ongoing, evolving mess, and therefore it's kind of constant hypothesis for change rather than trying to implement any specific solution. So that kind of ties into the lean idea of Catchball. So I kind of think Catchball is a collaborative process to translate the organizational strategy into the daily tactical work. And it is just throwing ideas around the organization. So one piece of the organization, they'll take an idea, catch it, reflect on it, improve it, pass it on, either pass it back or pass it on to somewhere in the organization. So by throwing these ideas around the organization, we can get as many people involved in them. The other model I just picked up a couple of weeks ago as well is Jason Yip blogged about it. I believe it came from one colleague of his at Spotify, where they were talking about the way ideas get communicated. And the hypothesis behind this was, usually an idea just gets transmitted. So it's an all hands call. Somebody kind of goes, this is what we're doing, gets transmitted, and then it stops there. And what we need to be doing is have people received the idea, and have people understood the idea, and do people agree with the idea, and can people take that idea and convert it into action? So we want to actually try and do all of those. And I like that model because it kind of ties in with the idea of backbriefing. So again, this is something that Bungay talks about in Art of Action. I think of a process by which people can check whether the intent of their work has been clearly described and understood, and whether their plans to carry out that work will meet the intent. So it's not just kind of describing the work, transmitting the work, but if you're kind of giving people a brief, a mission, have that group of people understood, and the only way of getting and knowing whether they've really understood it is getting them to describe it back to you. So that's the back briefing idea. Again, I kind of like to do this with an A3, where you can kind of give people a piece of work and say, here's a tactic I'd like you to work on. They can go off and talk about what their understanding of what they've been asked to do is, fill it in an A3, bring it back, describe what their understanding of the context, the intent of what they're being asked to do, the higher intent, how that helps the business, who's going to be working on it, what their freedoms and constraints are, and then what their plan is. So that means that while we're giving people freedom to go off and do things, autonomy, and we're including as many people as possible, we still have a bit of a safety check, and we can still kind of check for alignment of are they planning on doing is what they're going to do, in line with what our intent is. So that's back briefing. And then that leaves this is the third A3. And this is really what this talk is about, is the X matrix. I kind of got called out on it when I did this talk last week. I said, we were waiting for you to bring the X matrix into it. So this is my how do I do a talk about the X matrix without talking about the X matrix for as long as possible? The X matrix is an A3 that has your true north, your aspirations, your strategies, your tactics, your evidence. So all those elements that I've talked about, where your true north informs your aspirations, aspirations are enabled by your strategies, strategies are implemented by the tactics, tactics hopefully generate evidence, and that evidence is evidence of achieving your aspirations. So we've got all those elements in there. And what we want them to do is be coherent. So it's kind of the idea, we want this to be wholehearted without any contradictions. So the little matrices in the corner are where we can start understanding how do these other elements, how coherent are they with each other? What are the correlations and how do they contribute to each other? But it's a many to many. So the one word I'm not using here is causation. we quite often people kind of go, we've got this aspiration and therefore we're going to do this strategy, and this strategy is implemented by these tactics, and it's really deterministic and linear. And I don't think it is. You know, when we're working with complex problems, it's messier than that. So the X matrix kind of gives you a way of visualizing this messy coherence between all the different elements that we need in place for a transformation. So this one at the top left, it's a solid dot, which means I think there's a strong correlation, kind of a fairly direct contribution between this tactic at the top, cross-skilling, and our strategy of increasing flow. So this is it's a real example, but I've had to kind of, for NDA purposes and all that, I've kind of had to abstract it and water it down a little bit. But one of the projects we worked on, one of the initiatives, one of our tactics was about cross-skilling people. So we had more skills liquidity, people could take on more work because they weren't kind of siloed and only capable of doing one small type of work. We felt that if we worked on cross-skilling people, it would increase flow. And we were pretty confident there's a strong direct correlation and contribution between cross-skilling and flow. So that's what the solid dot means there. And then down the bottom, you've kind of got this empty dot. So this is a weak indirect correlation or contribution. So here we thought, if flow is a strategy, if we implement flow as a strategy, it's going to have some sort of impact on reducing the number of defects, which was one of the aspirations. But it's not direct, it's not strong. So there's something in there. So this was a result of a good few hours, probably half a day's worth of conversations around not just filling out what the aspirations, strategies, tactics, and evidence are, but how do they relate to each other? How are they coherent? And one of the benefits of this is starting to draw out the misunderstandings and the different opinions around, well, what do we mean by flow? What do we mean by fewer defects? What do we mean by cross-skilling? And what we're trying to highlight is, where do some people think there's a strong correlation, and where do some people think there's no correlation? Because that's that difference of opinion is telling us something. So it's not about this being right or wrong. And you might be looking at this and kind of going, I don't agree with some of those dots and those correlations. That's almost the point of this. It's trying to draw that out so that we get good enough alignment, but we're not trying to make it perfect. So it's about creating that messy coherence between all the different elements. And one of the quotes I like from one of the books on the X matrix is, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it's something like, it's the conversation that creates alignment, not the piece of paper. Again, what I don't want this is to be, the X matrix is not just something that, another document that once a central group fills that in, hands it around the organization and says, there's our strategy. This is about going and having a conversation around, does this make sense to you? What don't you understand? What don't you agree with? So it helps with that communication. So what you end up then is what I think of as nested PDSA cycles. So that X matrix is probably something you're going to do on a, maybe an annual basis, but that's quite a slow cycle. Because, if your tactics are hypothesis and your evidence is the feedback for those, it's not quick feedback. So you have a PDSA cycle underneath that, which is I kind of think of that's your backbriefing cycle. Runs a little bit more quicker. You can get faster feedback there, and then your backbriefing leads into a much tighter cycle around your experiment A3s. So that this is the kind of the different cycles and the different ways that we can engage everyone ever in the organization by getting them involved in the experiments, defining, running the experiments, but they're coherent with a brief that we communicate and we manage through backbriefing. And then those backbriefing A3s are all part of the larger X matrix, which brings it all together. So I think of it as ebb and flow. There's some cadence to it and there's some sense of order to it, but these things are all going on at the same time to some extent. So preparing the next matrix is kind of that situational awareness. Where are we now? And then we might go into a planning cycle of, well, where are we heading? And we plan through an X matrix and maybe do some initial back briefing. Piloting here is steering. So we plan and then we check back in and have that feedback cadence of, are we heading in the right direction? Do we need to replan? And then at the next level of detail, well, what do we do next? Pivot, pause, persevere. Do we just carry on with what we're doing because we think it's working? Is there something that we were doing that we maybe want to stop and go back and replan on? Or is there something which is kind of working? We've just learned something new and interesting and we're going to pivot and take it in a different direction. So this ebb and flow is part of, I think, a core part of how do we engage everyone everywhere in the organization and in the transformation. So that's kind of the meat of the talk, really. I'll just kind of wrap up with a few slides, but kind of trying to get that back to the idea of outcome-oriented continuous transformation, engaging everyone everywhere. To me, that's a complexity-informed approach to transformation. Doesn't have to be agile. Just agile is the world I tend to live in. So that's kind of where this came from. I kind of come across this quote from Mintzberg again. In Strategy Safari, which was one of those quotes that jumped out at me and I wasn't expecting. Best way to manage change is to allow for it to happen, to set up the conditions whereby people will follow their natural instincts to experiment and transform their behaviors. And to me, that's that. Set up an organization, set up the system so that change happens. People can take these small steps. They know what direction they're going with, but they can start running experiments and some kind of transform things themselves. So again, everyone's engaged. It's not a central group pushing this down. The other insight I had from this book was this paper. I'm not sure whether anybody's come across this, but Eisenstadt Spectrum Beer wrote this paper, Why Change Programs Don't Produce Change, at the same time that Kotter wrote his book on the 8 steps. And they were peers in the same college. What I find fascinating is that Kotter's 8 steps are the ones that have become wildly popular and everybody kind of talks about. And these 6 steps here, which I think are more interesting and more relevant, I certainly didn't know about it. I've not come across people that are familiar with this. But to me, this is more about how do you kind of create that environment for change. And kind of engage people and mobilize people. Don't push things down on people and just tell people what to do. Set of books there. I'll be sharing the slides later. So if anybody's kind of interested in what sort of things I've been reading to come up with this. And then I guess my goal with this is within any transformation, how do we shift from organizational change fatigue, where the typical reaction is, yet another change program. Why is this one going to work when the last one didn't? Through to organizational change further, where people are excited about change, they're engaged in it, they're contributing to it. It is making a difference to them. And it's just, it just becomes the way of life. It's not a separate change program. So that's my agile. Just to wrap it up, all these books, finished with the last page is that's my train, because so this is my agile. It's UKT. I don't think that's going to catch on as an acronym or a phrase, but outcome oriented continuous transformation, engaging everyone everywhere. And that's my slides done. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Karl.
I'm going to stop sharing and then I can see people's faces.
Right. Well, I was gonna kick off the questions and I had one I was gonna put out there, but we already had some questions come in and they're really good. So
all right.
And so I'll start with those. And feel free to either raise your hand or just ping a question to me and I'll try to get everyone as close to in order so that we can all have a chance to share ideas and chat.
Yeah, and I'd love this to be a conversation as well, rather than just Q&A.
Q&A, right? Okay, yeah, that sounds good. So Patrick, then why don't you're the first person you have 2 questions, so You can go ahead and tee those up if you as we go on these to get started.
Hey, Carl.
Hi, Patrick.
So I love the consistent direction of your work. Now I do have a couple of questions. Working with, I think a complexity-informed approach needs to deal with reality, right? Not with the idealized, but with reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reality of large incumbent organizations is that they can't come up with a true north. They simply can't. It's not that they don't want to, it's that they can't. And the reason why they can't is that there's so many opposing forces. If you think about the Three Horizons framework, they're caught in the missing mix between Horizon 3, Horizon 1. They need to run their current business. They need to innovate in their future business. Political forces, so many opposing forces that it's simply impossible for them to come up with a strategic, with a true north. So that might just undermine everything, right?
Yes, and start where you can. So I guess even when I'm using this model, I might start with it down at a team level or a business unit level. So yeah, these big organizations are, actually maybe what we need to do. So it'd be very easy to take this model that I've just kind of gone through and try and implement it as a big bang approach, which is, it's like trying to implement agile in a waterfall approach. So what again, going back to that idea of what can you do to make today better, where can you maybe do something? And I don't think you have to do the whole model itself, actually. So one way I use the model is sometimes it's in my head and I don't verbalize it. So I won't actually talk about true north, but I'll be kind of thinking, well, what might their true north be? And I might be testing some ideas and getting feedback and seeing how people react. But I'll quite often, I won't kind of go in there with an X matrix and kind of go, right, let's fill this out, because people can't cope with that. But we can kind of go, well, what little things can we do? And even, I'd say even organizations struggling with true north, most organizations struggle with strategy, just articulating what their strategy is. But having the model out there helps kind of nudge people towards it, I think.
Yeah. So the alternative would be to face that reality and just say, well, if opposing forces are the true obstacle, let's learn how to deal better with opposing forces.
Yeah.
So that could be an alternative.
Yeah. So, and I'd wonder, how does that play into strategy, or how does that inform your tactics, or how would you know whether what evidence would you look for that are going to tell you that those opposing forces are conflicting less?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
my other question was, so I thought I coached a kids hockey team, and we tried to retrospect them into a better play. I must say that was very disappointing, right? So we had a retrospective every break. So they were closest to the miss. We had a retrospective every break. It's very hard to retrospect yourself into greatness. So if you want to formulate a hypothesis, you need a model. And I think the absence of general models or general knowledge about models of how work works might be the true obstacle here. If you don't have a model of how work works, it's very hard for you to come up with hypotheses.
So I wonder where the model is the strategy. So your model is going to be the thing that guides your choices. So strategy is the guiding policy that inform what we do or help us make decisions. That, to me, that's that's what I'm kind of, that's my initial reaction is when you're talking about a model, you're kind of going, well, what's our strategy? I would agree though, the people close to the problem doesn't mean we just kind of allow them to throw spaghetti at the wall and reinvent the wheel. We still go in with some expertise, but we're not telling them what to do. We're making kind of going, oh, what would it look like if we tried this? Or, but also it's understanding their challenges. So understanding their challenges is different from them defining their solutions. So that kind of going to the Gemba is kind of helping understand what's really going on at the coalface. And then we could still, potentially as coaches, as experts, kind of go, well, there's this idea you might want to try. What hypothesis might we have? What might we do to test that hypothesis?
Yeah. For me, it's a call. It's actually a call for investing more time in finding models for how it works and sharing those models for how it works.
I'm always all for learning new models and coming up with new ways to think about work. Absolutely.
Something just struck me. Could this potentially be connected to the balanced measures or the balanced metrics for decision making as well that you mentioned a little bit? You touched on it as well, Karl, because this reminds me of an example that Larry Mascherone gives in his Odin framework about and I'm drawing this connection just because you talked about Patrick about the hockey team. He gives a basketball team example. Their desire is to win the games. And so they noticed that the star players were stealing shots from the rest of the team, and they won less when the star players were gone. They won more games because they were distributing the ball more effectively in multiple places across the court. So they started to measure a heat map of shots. While they're playing the game, the team members now can make decisions about, wait, should I pass? Should I shoot? Oh, wait, we usually make it, 40% shot. We make it from this. Maybe it's a good time. I'll take the shot, or I'll pass it to so and so down there. And they were able to make decisions that way. And I'm wondering if that's maybe a layer on this in terms of rather than retrospect. There is retrospective information in that data because it's like a heat map of what's happened and how they play and insights. But there's something about information that supports good decision making in the context that I think might be, I don't know, there's something I'm picking out there that could be a good place to go on this topic.
And good players tend to be players that understand the game, especially in team sports. Good players are players that understand the game very well and understand the laws that govern the game.
Yes.
So
and I do. Yeah, I do. So you might have noticed when I kind of worked through the taste model, I talked about transformations, aspirations, strategies. Then I talked about evidence before tactics. Because for me, it's about understanding the measures of success, those leading measures of success, and then you decide what we're going to do, which will generate those measures, which is similar to Larry's Odin. So, because he talks about outcomes he talks about outcomes, decisions, insight, measures, but then you can decide what you're going to do. If you do it the other way around and you do tactics before evidence, you just end up with confirmation bias, and you just end up measuring things which are reinforcing that your tactic is right, and you're less likely to kind of get measures which tell you that your hypothesis is wrong.
Right.
I think those, going back to Patrick's point, that evidence and those measures are probably based on a model, and based on some level of expertise that we think. I mean, you kind of get. I mean, I kind of think of everything in the X matrix is a hypothesis. Everything's testing everything else.
Well, but if you take the example that you pointed out in your matrix, cross-skilling, improving flow. So there's an assumption there. That's a model.
Yeah. Right? So there's the skills liquidity model. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that's a model. Now, most of the people that are teaching Kanban know a word about that. That's not what they teach. What is being taught is all the recipes. It's not the underlying models that are being taught. And I think that's the weakness. That's the actual
and that for me is an example of just jumping straight to tactics. All we're doing is teaching tactics, and we're not helping people understand what are the strategies behind those tactics, which, you know, models, the theories, and we're not even going to talk about how we're going to measure whether the things we're doing are the right things. Yeah.
Cool.
Oh, any other questions or ideas anyone thought were interesting they'd like to pick out?
Add to that, I can't actually submit to the chat for some reason. I agree with all of you. I think that everything that you've mentioned so far is definitely an aspect of it. I think maybe creating some sort of recursive support for the changes that are occurring in other areas of the business, right? So you don't get there overnight. But if we are having those conversations, they are less taxing cognitively, right? So if it's casual, talking about what they care about, talking about where they're headed, what their approach is going to be, and why in relation to the outcome that we're trying to get to, and looking for areas of opportunity in which those changes that we intend to make also sort of recursively support that, I think give us, I guess, more momentum towards where we're headed, and a greater understanding also of that interconnectedness that we otherwise would not see, because from where we're standing, you just have no insight into it. And I hope that made sense. But
yeah, it made me think about sharing learning as well, particularly when you've got different bits of the organization going on. If you've kind of got that model that shows here's our tactics, here's the things we tried, here's the evidence we saw, here's why we did that, the strategies, to be able to kind of talk about that across large organizations, I think is useful, rather than we did this here, we think it worked, we think you should do it as well. Or even worse, we're going to make you do it as well.
Tiani, I really liked what you said about the basketball team and the stars stealing shots. And immediately made me think of the team I'm working with at the moment, where there is a star developer. And it's the first team I've worked in a long time where it's the delivery manager and the product manager are essentially, they kind of give the work out and say, right, let's give this to Jack, let's give this to Leah, let's give this to Jane. And it would always be, oh, that's a good one for Jack, give that to Jack. And what we kind of started to see is that the kind of other people's skills were kind of atrophying, and we were losing all kind of liquidity. So tried to kind of take a page out of Chris Matt's book and say, actually, first of all, start by letting people ask, say who'd like to do this, and even sort of suggest that, work on something that you know nothing about. We have to work with this Apogee proxy, which if you've ever tried programming in XML, it's not fun at all. But it would end up with like one person who knew how it worked, and now we've got several people who know how it works. So I think it's the advice in the comments about this. How does a star become a star? I don't know if there's some kind of, it's sort of, I don't know if the kind of sort of competence or capability is kind of lopsided. So you've got somebody who is just has greater capability or just gets stuff done quicker. They become sort of focus of attention, or whether there's other things like charisma or kind of, I don't know what, but it's certainly, I find it an interesting kind of dynamic between sort of people who are either through their own sort of self-aggrandizement or through just the way their work is received become the star, and how you get the sort of the team as a whole to be the star, as it were.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was kind of thinking around shifting it to a football, soccer analogy around goals versus assists. And are you the star because you're scoring more goals, or you the star because you're generating more assists?
But I was wondering about that. I was thinking, like, how does David Beckham come to be the sort of golden boot or whatever within the context of a team? Would he always be? People say, oh, he's greatest striker of our generation or whatever. But how much of that is down to the way the team is kind of working?
Yeah, there's a I've got a book behind me.
I rather hoped you would.
So this is, but interestingly, it's not a software book. So this is it's called Football Hackers: The Science and Art of Data Revolution. So it's all about data in football, soccer, and it goes into all the theory and the background and the history of goals and expected goals and all the data they use and the amount of data that gets used within football nowadays. And a lot of this is, and the specialists they employ just to capture this data and then analyze the data and figure out buying and selling players and how does the players with particular playing styles fit into your team. So now you're looking at, maybe to get to your point of like, how do we use this for team formation? What's the profile of a star? What's the profile of somebody you want on your team? Maybe you need somebody that's specialist in a particular skill and they're the right person, but actually maybe you need somebody who's more defensive or more different kind of team player. So yeah, I kind of found that one actually I kind of fascinating because I'm interested in football, but just that whole kind of the way they use data I thought was fascinating.
And keep in mind that it's different. It's different in each game too, right? Or can be different. It can be different in different seasons, right? Depending on how other teams are built. That's where it starts to get into this complexity and this network kind of stuff.
And the data isn't, so there's some great examples in there where the data is just, the data says one thing should happen in a game. I think there's a classic Brazil-Germany game where if you look at the data, you kind of go, Brazil won that game 99%. Yeah. But actually Germany won it. It's just because Germany scored the few shots they had and Brazil missed all the shots that they had.
A moment can change the game, very, very significantly.
And you're working towards a fixed deadline in a football game as well. The clock will run out, and I think it's one of the most interesting things about any software thing, particularly Karl, when we were working on broadcast stuff. It's like you can't move that deadline, and your kind of the whole way you approach the work has to kind of sort of mutate or change as the clock ticks down.
Assuming it's a real deadline.
Well, but that's it. In broadcast, it is a kind of particularly when I've done stuff around marketing, where you kind of the money's been spent on the ads. In healthcare, not healthcare, in gyms and stuff. It's been called the golden quarter, which is the beginning of the year where that's when people like Nuffield Health, who I was working for, make all their money because people come out of Christmas going, God, I've got to go to the gym. It's like, right, book the ad slots. Okay, now we need all this back end stuff to support it. So,
but again, it depends on whether it's a real constraint or not. And oftentimes they're not. Yeah, I'm going to run it over to Dave.
Yeah, we have a hand raised, and I wanted to I'm going to make a placeholder to come back on the idea about the skills and the star player in a second. So, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah. So, two quick comments. One is as an ex high school basketball coach and lifelong Liverpool supporter. So, a couple of observations. Often on teams, there's a player out there who people go like, "Why is he out there?" And yet, as a coach, it's like they play better when that person's out there. It's like they do the dirty work, which doesn't show up. And I think that applies to work groups too. Sometimes there's some real key players that sort of run the whole thing, or at least make everyone better because of what they do. So I think it's kind of key to identify those people. And then kind of getting back to strategy, I'll just make a comment. You can tell me if I'm out to lunch or whatever. But in kind of along the lines of what you're saying, Patrick, too, is I think you do have a strategy. It's like everyone is actually operating to some kind of strategy, but it may be very different than what's written down. And sometimes you need to like tease out what are you really operating to? What's guiding you? What's your sort of informal strategy? And really tease that out, and then ask, is this really healthy or not?
So absolutely, I think. Well, I think that applies to that idea of emergent strategy, which is rather than somebody kind of going, here's our strategy. Yeah, everybody's doing their own things. What you want to do is to be able to spot those patterns and kind of going, oh, that's interesting. there's a bunch of things happening around this technology space or around this in this market, or customers are doing this interesting with our product. So that's interesting. What do we do with that? And maybe you kind of amplify that stuff. And to me, that's why strategy is continuous. But that's why you want to engage people in the strategy, because those are the people that generally spotting what everybody's doing. And I think it's Mintzberg again defined strategy as a pattern and a set of decisions. So actually, you look at what people are doing and deciding over time, and effectively that is your strategy. So you can't define it, but what you can do is spot it and kind of try and align people around it.
Yeah, because I worked for a very large company, and they have all these things about strategy, and yet if you really look at it, it was all about actions to either create more market share or defend market share. That's what they were really driving to. But that was never written down anywhere. But that was really what the actions and decisions were based around. Yeah,
and I think that's the diagnosis piece of what Rummel talks about. That somebody knows, but not everybody knows. And I would find that sort of like a key piece of information. Like, what mess are we dealing with? What problem are we trying to solve? If people don't know that, then they're just doing stuff because they think it's the right thing with the best of intentions, usually.
Right.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks.
You.
Fiona, you had a placeholder.
Yeah.
I did have a placeholder. I was typing it up, but since we're having a little bit of a lull, I'll share it. It was
Kyle just jumped on. Well,
yeah. Kyle. Yep.
I just want to jump in on the sports thing real quick. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
My I think mine could be could tee you up maybe. I guess. So Kat, it reminds me some of this conversation on the skills and the complexity that's involved there, and how people contribute their skills and learn together and perform together to achieve outcomes, to actually, they're to doing the strategy deployment. Kat Swattel talks a lot about allocating rare skills last, is a topic that I've heard her speak about. So in bringing it back to software development, this idea that people who are the experts, the star, it's easy and faster for them to do certain things. If they were to float and let others take that work, where it's a stretch for them and they get as far as they can till they get stuck, and then they go unstick them and they float around helping others do that, over time, it helps raise the level of skill across the organization and creates greater liquidity of those skills. So I just thought that was one. It just popped back into my brain from a conversation I'd had with her some time ago. Kyle, you wanted to jump in on the sports and skills.
Yeah, want to throw another in, and just to keep provoking that conversation, team dynamics. And in American football, individuals on the offensive line, there's no real good metric for their performance, not like a running back or a quarterback or even a corner. But as a unit, there are good metrics, and they're also usually the highest paid people on the team. So they are valuable. They're recognized for their value. But again, it's kind of like a phalanx where there's not a lot of value to any one individual, but they have to be in sync as a unit to be able to.
Oops.
Actually, the offensive line is interesting because it used to be the lowest paid group. And then when they went to more of a free market on salaries, it's one of the highest paid groups.
Yeah, as much as I dislike the coaching role metaphor kind of in this whole thing, since we're on the sports metaphor, though, is the spotlight is rarely on those coaches, but those are essential, like literally essential to building good teams. And it shouldn't be on the coaches, but they're one of those things we were talking about before, is like when they go away, you're going to have problems. I'm using coach very, very broadly.
So we've used an analogy with teams that American football is complicated. The coaches command and control calling the plays, while we'll call real football is more around you set up strategy, tactics, formation, skill development. But once the game starts, it's about the players. It's a totally different metaphor. It's more of a complex approach. So it's kind of interesting, the two aspects.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was reading something today about, so there's a big thing at the moment, and I don't know, certainly in the UK, about, coaches having their styles and their approach, and building teams around their approach. But this was I think, talking about Carlo Ancelotti, who's just won the European Championship with Real Madrid, and he was kind of going, that I don't do that. I have a group of players. I know what their players' strengths and weaknesses are, and I get the team to play to the strengths and weaknesses and play to the context. So, a very different approach to kind of, the whole with I don't know, Pep Guardiola and Klopp, and game and press, and there's all this kind of, the team has an identity. He was like, my team doesn't have identity. My team just has a bunch of players, and I'll get those players to play to their strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, and how do they do that? They do that by essentially setting and modulating constraints, right? If you call a particular play after a timeout, that's a constraint. That's an enabling, or whatever you want to call it, but it's a constraint of some kind that allows people to act, or a strategy going into a particular game, or a general strategy of how you're going to approach that season. Those are all constraints.
Yeah, and what the manager's doing there on the side during the game is when they're making substitutions or making tweaks, they're making systemic interventions. So they were talking about in the semi-final, Real Madrid were 1-0 down with, in the last 5-10 minutes, made a substitution, and that substitution was to take off a tired player and replace them with a tall, kind of muscular forward that could change the dynamics of the game. And it's like a retrospective coherence, nice story. That striker came on and won the game for them, scoring 2 goals. So it's a great story. But but from a systemic point of view, what the manager's doing is looking at the dynamics in the game, and trying to change some of those patterns.
Right. And I want to, before I'll throw it over to Patrick, but you're modulating, or you're changing those constraints continuously depending to match the situation that you're in.
Right.
And I just want to make that clear, because oftentimes people who haven't been in this for a long time think of constraints as something that you apply and then you manage to that constraint, which you can do, but that's not an adaptive system, and you can get in trouble doing that.
Yeah, and I just got one last thing before we kind of hand over. I think of strategy as an enabling constraint rather than a governing constraint. It's something there to enable people to figure out how to solve the problem.
Yeah.
I just want to say welcome back, Kyle. I'm going to take Patrick and Barbara's hands, and then feel free to come back in when you're ready. Yeah.
I want to take it back to the world of work.
Yeah.
Sorry, I brought us to sports.
Yeah.
And so going back to this over specialization, lack of liquidity. Chris McDermott, a couple of sessions back, or I don't know, talked about practice theory and how practices form a network. So there's something to be said about kind of the dynamics of a rich get richer dynamics with specialization, but there's also something we said in terms of how practices influence each other. So, for example, the way we break up work might actually reinforce current knowledge silos, or actually break it down. So if I break, typically in organizations, how do we break down work? We break down work according to the knowledge silos. I break it a piece of value in terms of, well, I know Carl is good at this, so I'll give Carl that task. While another approach would be breaking down, where you're actually incentivizing people to collaborate. So I think having knowledge about how those practices influence each other, how they inform each other, how they support each other, is actually the key to a knowledge-based a complexity-informed approach to organizing work. I think that is the key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mine goes back to strategy there when you say that around, and it's almost like if flow is a strategy, then incentivizing teams to collaborate is probably more about a strategy based on the economy of flow versus breaking down work to keep people busy, which is more of a utilization strategy.
Yeah. Well, the question is there one ring to rule them all, right? So if you think about flow, maybe flow is not the ultimate, right? If you think about collaboration, maybe collaboration is not the ultimate. If you think about learning, maybe learning is not the ultimate. You can't leave out one of them. All three are important, and there might be some others. All three are important, and they reinforce each other. They form enabling constraints for each other, right?
Right. And which one you're focused on is whatever is going on in that situation at that time. There just doesn't need to be an ultimate. And in fact, that's going to get you in trouble.
Exactly.
Right.
That's why it's continuous.
Mm.
And
I guess that's ebb and flow. Yeah.
Yeah. Barbara.
First of all, that sports stuff was just fascinating. I just want to thank you all. Thank you, Patrick, for bringing it back to this, because, oh my God. And I just want to, for me, the reason I raised my hand is that Yulia actually said something super interesting in the chat. And if you want to jump in, Yulia, and talk about it yourself, because this is something that I focus on a lot, right? Which is that we talk and talk and talk. But meanwhile, back in the business schools, who will be the managers, it is like a completely different scenario. So Yulia, if you would unmute yourself and take it away, I'd really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much. I didn't expect that. Yeah, teaching strategic management, teaching change management, employability, and leadership. So we all end up talking about strategy, either personal or company and so on. Sadly enough, the more I see the curriculum, the more there is still SWOT, PESTEL analysis, and all the stuff from the 80s. So Dave Snowden normally all the time says that, that's very, very far from the situation of complexity. So I keep on asking him, I keep on asking people in this room as well. So what would be the one or maybe three things that would be helpful to install into the heads of the first-year students, third-year students, master students, so that they understand the strategy from not something that scares them, but something that they can do easier. So I was looking through your presentation and, well, that's super interesting, but how many people actually can get it in the form of the book, of the template, or of the something that they can try out? What would be the first step or three easy things? I don't know, whatever, how much we hate those three easy steps to do, but what would you recommend actually embedding into curricula already?
So one of the things that's slightly more accessible, maybe, which I think is still kind of coherent with what I do. And I saw one of your comments, and I'll pull up the book list back for you. Actually, I could just put that up while I'm talking, because I'm going to talk about one of those books. I'll share my screen again. Is that coming through again?
Yep.
So I didn't really talk about Agendashift explicitly, which is this kind of book in the top right from Mike Burrows, other than I kind of mentioned Mike when I talked about wholehearted. Agendashift is kind of a really, I think, accessible way of doing a lot of the stuff that I've just talked about, starting with outcomes. So, you can see he's got outcome-oriented change, continuous transformation. So I've worked with Mike a lot, and kind of we've influenced each other a lot on this. Mike has a kind of a nice set of exercises and a flow of exercises that start kind of getting people thinking about the ideal future, aligning people towards what they want to work on, bringing in things like clean language, what's it like when we're working at our best, and collaborating on things like that to pull it together thinking in terms of outcomes, outcome roadmaps. He then brings in things like, a 4 points Cynefin kind of exercise, but based on outcomes. Something that we came up, which we called option relationship mapping, which is basically taking Simon Wardley's Wardley mapping, but doing it slightly differently, but very, very heavily influenced by that, again, with outcomes. So how are the different outcomes that we want to achieve with our transformation, and how do they connect and link together up to customer need, or kind of meeting some sort of need. And then, so that's kind of mapping out your landscape, situational awareness, using a few techniques, which then gets you into hypothesis and what we do. So kind of the short answer, I think, is in terms of something that probably is not well known, which I think is very accessible, is Agendashift. I'm not sure whether that kind of answers your question.
So thanks a lot. Yeah, this is interesting. I think 3 of those we show to students of these books, but that's also a question of actually getting the hands into
so Agendashift is really practical. And if I'm going to kind of just run through. Rummel is probably my favorite book on strategy, particularly in terms of that idea of most strategy is bad strategy. So how do you what is good strategy and leverage points? The strategy safari, I guess that's probably one you guys just just as a an overview of all the different views on it. The idealized design, kind of that Ackoff's view on strategy and change, the art of action, Bungay's view, and kind of taken from the military. Getting the right things done is really a kind of very accessible strategy deployment book, and introduces a lot of ideas around A3 thinking and A3s. And then Hoshin Kanri for the Lean Enterprise is the kind of the X Matrix book. I put it on here because because I talk a lot about the X Matrix. I recommend it with reservation. It's really dry and hard to read, and it's very manufacturing progress focused, and it's not really it's not really complexity informed. One of the things that I've tried to do is take the ideas of the X Matrix from that and kind of go, how do you put a complexity lens on it? So that's why I've kind of changed a lot of the language around it, but I still think it's applicable. It's very expensive as well, that book, but got nuggets of gold in it.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
So I saw another hand, but I think they may have had to drop. I saw some thoughts here from you, Carrie, that look kind of interesting. Maybe we could go there next if you'd like to share.
Sure. I'm more coherent when I write, so I apologize. But that was what I was trying to share before, actually. So maybe it's a little clearer that way. But I think if we understood not just how every other department maybe or area of the business is impacted by us, or we could potentially be impacted by them. I'm not saying we need to memorize that or have an accounting of all of it, but when we talk about that, we get that shared insight that then can be considered in the solutions that we are designing. And if we know what change that they are going to attempt towards that alignment for the overall business objectives, then I think that there are opportunities in different departments where we can align to that. And in terms of our successes, we may very well be able to create greater success at those attempts to change by doing it that way or designing for it that way.
Yeah, I think I agree 100% with you. I think that's, it's kind of what I was hopefully trying to say, but unless you kind of think I said something that was different. But that idea of engaging everyone everywhere is cool. Go out to the pockets, but potentially the X Matrix becomes a way. One, I think kind of that what I call the taste framework becomes a way of having a bit of common language to which we can talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then the X Matrix can be a way of visualizing it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I thought everything you said was exactly that as well.
Cool. Good to hear.
Shasta, I see your Zoom rejoined, but I did see your hand up before, so please do chime in.
Sure. Yeah, it's not exactly a question, just more. I'm coming are joining these meetings from a design and UX perspective. It sounds like Carrie was maybe talking a little bit about design when I got back on. And I just was thinking about the engaging everyone everywhere part of the presentation, and just how, I think a lot of this has been from the agile engineering perspective, but all of these things are also in this UX world and design world as well. And I was especially thinking of like research and just like, how I was working more in an enterprise level. So I got to, actually talk to people whose maybe the mess they were in was the software we were designing for them. And so there were opportunities to co-design, or I would have liked more opportunities to get a little further into that. But so I don't know, just was like thinking about how each one of the pieces that Karl was sharing, like, how design also can help facilitate alignment and aspects of all of this. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
When you say design, you're talking about user experience design. Is that what you're?
Yeah. And there's the different elements of it. There's the research aspect, and just also came to mind that overlapping the team sport metaphor, that if you just talk about just an engineering team, but also if we're working on something, these things are so complex that you can't, if they weren't complex, we'd just be doing it alone, right? So that's why you've got, so many people involved in this stuff. And
and I don't think of this as I don't think of this as engineering specific at all. Maybe that's a perception of agile, but to me, it's it's more about the transformation and the organization and whatever that group is, that team or team of teams, and to bring it back to the skills, like what skills does that team need to carry out its mission? Just the back briefing A3 I have, one of the sections I have in my back briefing A3 is what people and skills do we need, and if that needs design skills, then we need to highlight that and kind of make sure we've got those people or those skills on the team.
Oh, yeah, thanks for
just.
Sure, I think it was more like some of the some of the team examples were like just the engineering teams, and often I think that's what's thought of with agile. So that's good.
Yeah,
just to clarify.
Yeah, I certainly don't limit to that. It's just maybe that's the space I started with.
Well, in using the team sports metaphor, which none of us are super fond of, but if we were to, a professional team, there are a lot of people involved, a vast majority that never step on the court, but are critical to everything, right? Or they just step on the court for a period of time. You even got the referees, you got the people running around wiping up the sweat when people wipe out, whatever, right? There are all sorts of critical roles. And so I think all the stuff that you're talking about, Karl, would apply to all of them. They're just visible in different parts of the organization at different time. You can even talk about the marketing team on a pro sports team, right? Critical stuff.
Yeah. There's big. So it's those specialist coaches. What's the one I was thinking? Oh, well, kind of nutritionists and injury. Yeah. How do we stop our players getting injured? How do we make sure that they're the right level of fitness?
Yeah, you take them out, or you offshore that kind of role, and you're going to have problems. It's going to affect the overall system.
Yeah.
Right. Any other thoughts? I did see Dave, you put a question in the chat around flow. Did you want to follow up on that, or?
Yeah, just the tendency is what's measured gets gamed. Really thinking about if we're focusing on flow and not being some of the big background in agile, how might that show up if people are actually gaming it? Sort of the appearance of flow, metrics wise, and until everything breaks down, and sort of how do you know?
Yeah, so one of the exercises I'll do. So if you start with flow, so if we're talking about flow as a strategy, Then you get into, well, what evidence would we look for? And that's your metrics. But those kind of that wheel of 6 metrics that I showed is well, we need a balance of those. So one question is, what happens if we have too much flow? What bad things might we see? What are the negative consequences of too much flow? It's probably going to be poor quality, or low value. We might, we've got a really good flow, but we're just delivering crap. Because we're doing the low hanging fruit. We're just working on things that are easy to do, and we're not doing the hard things. So so once you've kind of had that conversation, then what might we measure to make sure that we got a balance? And let's not just measure flow. Let's make sure we've got that balance to spot when we're over focusing.
Yeah, or slow down. So I just retired from Boeing, so I totally get what you're talking about.
I don't know what you mean.
Yeah, no.
Well, if you can, you want to look for metrics that, when they're gained, actually improve the system. That's a little shout out to Chris Matz. He was talking about that quite a bit. Lead time is a good example of that. Right? If it's used to improve the system, or if somebody is coming in and is attempting to game the system that somehow shines a light on the system in such a way that it could be improved, that is a decent use of a metric.
Yeah. So interesting. I had a conversation with somebody kind of almost about that conference a couple of weeks ago. And so I used, throughput as an example of that. You want higher throughput, you break things into more smaller pieces. And that's generally a good thing. But I did talk to somebody who said, yes, and they might break things down into small, pointless pieces that don't add up again. So there's still a danger. But gaming can be used for good, but you can't guarantee it.
Well, you want to pay attention to those constraints. I call what you just said subtasks, which I hate because of that. They're so small. Yeah, potentially. Almost always. There are a few use cases. But again, you apply a constraint onto that. Right sizing is a type of constraint that I like to talk about a lot. But that whole idea.
An interesting thing around flow and the whole system working too is did some work with medical departments, like a radiology clinic. The whole flow of the clinic, and even doctors' offices and others, is all dependent on one person, or heavily dependent on one person. And that's the person at the front desk who schedules things, who happens to be the lowest paid person in the building. And so, it's kind of really interesting. Talk about constraint. A constraint could be what you pay your schedulers. But often it's the unnoticed people who are the ones who are actually really key or critical in the overall flow.
Yep.
Right. Jocko, you had your hand up for a second. Did you already say what you want?
I'm sure I've said too much already, but that kind of ties into what Shasta was talking about earlier too, is because UX is traditionally always been difficult to describe how they operate in the flow, because sometimes they're always there, sometimes they're on the team level, sometimes they're working with multiple teams, sometimes they're working with none of the teams really on a permanent manner. So there are plenty of roles like that you just can't plug them in. They have to be given thought in terms of how they operate in the network. But they're critical, is my point.
I had a question for you, Karl, around you mentioned the idea of tactics versus strategy and strategy thing, like where you focus and starting with the tactics first. Is that something that you often point out explicitly, or do you kind of like scaffold that so that the groups you're working with get the insights that they need to focus more strategically versus going to tactics first? And maybe is there a contrast that you can draw between like where they want to go and where they are now, and the how they think about work? There's something there I thought was interesting. I wanted to know like how your experience with teams.
I'd probably scaffold it in that I use that taste framework as a scaffolding. So if the people are doing the tactics and I'm I'm not sure why they're doing it, or I might have an opinion as to whether it's the right thing or not, then we can kind of work back from there. And the first thing is well, what evidence would we look for if this is the right tactic? So now we can have a kind of more open conversation rather than me just kind of going, I think you're wrong, you should do this instead. I can kind of say, well, I have a different perspective and opinion. How could we decide? How do we maybe go back to Patrick's point? How do we resolve this conflict? How can we treat this as a hypothesis or two competing hypotheses, and run some experiments or kind of capture some data which helps us understand which is right? Then I might kind of take it back a level and kind of going, well, why would we decide one over the other? And is there some strategic conversation we can have? And then ultimately you kind of then bring them back to, well, actually, what are we trying to achieve? What are our aspirations and organization? Tie that in. So often I'll not kind of go in with the full model and kind of go, right, let's go back to blank piece of paper, first principles, and work back down, meet people where they are, but use the model. And sometimes it's just me using it in my own head to try and understand the context and kind of shape the conversation. Sometimes I might kind of go, well, actually, here's this model that I'm using. How do these things fit into this model? And that's really contextual. And I guess that's, how big a prod do I want to give the system? Sometimes you want to give it a big prod and kind of open it up a little bit more.
Right.
Patrick, you look like you're either giving me 5 minutes warning.
I'm just wondering now. So isn't exactly the language of strategy and tactics in a complexly informed approach, isn't that problematic? So
in what way?
Yeah. So if I take your X matrix again, and then you look at collaboration, is that a tactic with respect to flow, or is that? And I wouldn't know.
No, that's a conversation. That's where I kind of go. I don't care. I don't care as long as we. Well, I might care, but generally, so a lot of the time, if I am doing the full X matrix, a lot of the time is things bouncing backwards and forwards around and exactly having that conversation. Is this a tactic or is this a strategy? Usually, what it means is Dave talks about breaking things down to a low level of granularity to resolve these conflicts. Usually, it's that sort of thing. It's like, let's be a bit more specific around, if collaboration is a tactic, let's be a bit more specific around what we're going to do to increase collaboration. And maybe let's be a bit more specific about what we mean by collaboration as a strategy, and to help articulate why it's a strategy versus why it's a tactic. And it's probably both. What we've identified is there's some kind of correlation there between the two.
So I'd say both from a conceptual standpoint as well as from a practical standpoint, it has its problems, in my opinion. So it does lead into linear causal reasoning. It reinforces linear causal reasoning. There needs to be a cause, right?
There needs to be a correlation, not necessarily a causation or a that's why I use correlation, contribution, coherence. I think those things are great. I think different from causation.
So does collaboration cause flow?
No.
I think collaboration might contribute to increasing flow.
It's a problem.
It might enable flow.
Might enable flow. So that's a correlation.
Might there be a
but we're not saying,
enablement?
but it's not.
Might there be a mutual enablement? So
could be.
If I'm working on 5 work items at the same time, and in comes the collaboration coach and says to me like, hey, you need to collaborate more.
It's not causal.
Are you
It's not causal. There's a big conversation. But I think your point taken is that the perception of causality might be the way that I would put it. But in the complex system, no, you have things interacting and changing each other all the time. So there is no causality. If you want to get all philosophical, which Barbara would love to do, even the philosophers can't agree on causality. So there's a subjectiveness to that. But that's one of the big things in complex systems that we like to look at.
Yes.
Karl.
And that's why I like the X matrix, because having that matrix and showing the many to the many, and having that ability to say, strong, medium, weak. And actually, I think in the original X matrix books, he has 4 levels, but I just find that kind of too complex, too complicated. But just having that conversation around how do these things relate to each other. Causality usually means I think people think causality is just 1-to-1. If we do this, we'll get this, and it's nice and simple. To me, there's lots of things we're doing, and there's multiple strategies, hopefully not too many, and each tactic might influence multiple strategies, and each strategy can be implemented by multiple tactics, just taking that corner. So it's a many to many, and there's different levels of correlation between that in that many to many. So to me, that's messy coherence. So these things fit together.
Are there cycles?
Or patterns. Could be in the form of a cycle.
I mean, there's in the X matrix, there's the 4 quadrants, so the whole thing should fit together. So you should be able to talk around. If we do this tactic, it's going to help generate this evidence. If we generate these pieces of evidence, it'll help us with these aspirations. So and these aspirations we think we're going to implement by deploying these strategies, and these strategies we think we can implement by using these tactics, and it's many to many all the way around.
You're going to have a hard time convincing people that some aspirations might help with implementing some tactics.
Well, that's indirect. The tactics go to the strategy. So on the way around, tactics implement strategies lead to aspirations, and then tactics lead to evidence, and evidence leads to aspirations. So you've got 2 ways of going around that.
Okay, break it up, you guys.
Each to your corner.
Well, I know some people have a hard stop at the top of the hour, so I wanted to kind of get us on our way to winding up the conversation. If there's any last thoughts or question, really quick, and then we'll move to a close. No, okay. Well, thank you, Karl. That was really, really excellent, and thank you everyone for all of your questions and ideas. It was a really great conversation, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next time at the lounge.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. I'll share my slides with you one way or another. Thanks, everyone.